I think from the outset that I have to say, and I think it's obvious from my bio, I'm not a scholar of Central Europe or any region in particular. My field is boring philosophy. That's what I have done all my life. I know nothing else. And so, on the one hand, perhaps I'm not a fitting speaker on this series of which I devoted to extremely important topics, but I was thinking how I could contribute. But then I started thinking about my experiences at Yale University, of all places, where I had a fellowship in previous academic year. And there I was ascribed to a Baltic program in what Americans call area studies, or in Lithuania we would call them regional studies. And I was ascribed to the Baltics because that's where I'm from. And so, very strangely to me, I came as a researcher, but suddenly I felt myself more than less of a subject of research and more of an object. So people were asking me about the Baltics or the region, etc., etc., etc. And there I realized that I have some expertise, but less as a scholar, but more as an individual who's existing in this particular space. So I was in that light, I will try today to suggest a way of thinking about Eastern and Central Europe, about basically the region in which we, or in which I find myself, and certainly some of you do. And uh, I hope that from that suggestion, something fruitful might emerge, hopefully for me, but that, of course, will be up for you. It will be for you to decide. As long as I remember, and I remember basically anything since 1990, I always wanted to be Western. And more particularly, I wanted to be Western European. I always knew that I hated the place where I was born, not in the sense that I disliked the landscape or I disliked my own biography, but I just knew that the culture in which I was born, and culture in a broader sense, not just Lithuanian, but this regional culture, was somehow not enough. Not it wasn't nothing. It wasn't a complete collapse, but it was not of the appropriate standard. And I'm pretty sure that I was not alone. At the time, for sure, I will quote Ivan Sanders, a Hungarian intellectual, in the spring of 1990. So Germany is already united, but Soviet Union is still in place. He writes, for centuries, Poles, Czechs, and Hungarians were propelled by the desire to live up to European standards. So there's clearly something more going on than just my individual predicament. Um, uh, I think it's fair to say that Eastern Europe for the last, or Eastern Central Europe for the last 35 years uh, had one goal: to become Western. And at least in Lithuania, but to my knowledge, basically all the other countries in Central Europe were guided by this idea, and basically all the attempts in terms of doing business, politics, culture, etc., were judged by one and only standard. Does that make us more Western? And if yes, then we're going to do it. Or for the war, at the minimum, does it make us less Eastern? By Eastern, of course, it was understood not Asian or Japanese, Chinese, but of course, Russian first and foremost. Um, the peculiarity of the situation in the 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union was that there was no question, it seems to anyone, both in the West, in Central Europe, and in the East, that the West has won, that the Cold War ended not in some form of uh, uh, peaceful agreement that it's a draw, or that somehow the situation has changed and we decided that we have other things to attend. No, it was very clearly decided that the West, it was clear to everyone, I'm sorry, that the West has won, and the East now wants to become the West, at least in terms of economics, first and foremost, because the West was much better off, but also in political system. By that was meant democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. So in Lithuania, for example, early 90s, one of the most popular slogans was, "We will live like Sweden." And by "we will live like Sweden," it was meant that we want to be as rich as the Swedes and also enjoy something that some civic and cultural standards that the Swedes are enjoying. Of course, that slogan, as many slogans do, it was of limited value, of perhaps of limited value, because Lithuanians knew very, very little of how Swedes live and what problems they are facing at the time and even now. But perhaps for that reason also, it was very easy for some politicians to promise that we'll catch up with Sweden, and then it will be, everything will be solved. It's ironic to me, of course, that that slogan was just uh, uh, another version of the Soviet slogan, because basically the Soviets were promising the same. We will catch up and overtake Khrushchev, and then later Brezhnev were proposing precisely the same ideas, of course, not in political sense, but in economic for sure. So even the Soviets, at least late Soviets, acknowledged that the West is something to be aspired to, is something that is in front of us. And in that sense, of course, we're implying that we are some sort of a lesser entity. Of course, there's a debate how they would interpret that, but the ground was fertile to acknowledge that the West is the place to be, and we have to start running towards the West. And basically, for the last 30 years, I think that's what Eastern and Central Europe has been doing. We were running towards the West. But I think all of that has come under a series, all that strategy, if you will, of that when we will fully integrate into the West, there will be a sense of arrival and sense of accomplishment of our destiny. I think the cracks were already showing before 2022, in the sense that some Central and Eastern European countries have overtaken some Western European countries in terms of economics, or they were doing better in terms of some civic rights, etc., etc. But somehow the sense of arrival was not there. So there were already discussions in cultural, intellectual, and political circles in Central and Eastern Europe. So was that goal somehow real and tangible, in the sense that how are we going to know that? So when is this, passport of becoming the West will be issued, and who will issue that? But I think these were just the beginnings of the discussions, but I think really everything has changed in 2022 with the full-scale invasion in Ukraine by Russia. I think, and I'm sorry for a personal story, but at the moment, at the time of on the day of the invasion, I was involved in in a in a project in France. The team was a few French people and one Polish person and myself. And I remember on the morning of the 24th, when all the team got together, everyone was shaken, visibly shaken. Everyone has read the news, wherever they get the news from Lithuanian, Polish, French outlets and whatnot. So everyone knew what was there. But when I needed really to discuss the situation, somehow the guy who I felt completely understood what I'm talking about was the Polish guy. And it was such a strange experience to me that somehow I have this commonality, which up to this moment, I can't really articulate properly. That somehow I have this commonality with this Polish guy, and somehow that these other people, I'm not saying they don't get it, or they are stupid, or they don't care, but for them, it's just something else. It's just something else, which doesn't mean that they're bad people or they don't care. But for them, this war does not bring up the same sensibilities that me being a person with Lithuanian background and this other person with the Polish background that we had. So of course, one thing it was that, and trying to rationalize it, was that there was this recognition of Ukrainian plight. So it's clear that this attack and invasion is completely unjust, unwarranted, unprovoked, and outrageous. But that we felt, all of us. But somehow me and the Polish guy, we felt something more. We felt additional insecurity, which the French people didn't have. That was, of course, brought by our historical experiences, and having had this particular enemy, this particular country as an enemy, as an aggressor. But I think there was something more. There was something that I still don't know how to articulate, and the best allegory that I have come up with to explain it to myself was the story of the Czech deer. I don't know if you've heard about this research by biologists, but in 2014, Czech biologists tracked some deer on the border of Czech Republic and Germany. And they found, so they put the GPS trackers on some of them, and they found that in 2014, that they still do not cross what used to be the Iron Curtain. The normal deer lives for 15 years. So none of the existing deer in 2014 have lived when crossing that border was a mortal danger to anyone alive. There were a lot of people killed trying to cross it illegally, but also there were electrically charged fences, etc., etc. So the border now is gone. Of course, it's the EU, Schengen, and so there's no physical barrier. But the deer somehow carry the habits and the sensibilities of the generations past that somehow still inform their movement and their habitat. And I think there's something that is there in my own sensibilities. That's what I had to admit to myself in 2022, and that was, at least to me, and I from course, from anecdotal evidence, but at least to quite a few of Eastern European intellectuals, that was some sort of a discovery. Because if you have tried all the 35 years and you were doing everything you could to stop being Eastern European, and suddenly this event somehow shows that you haven't run away, that you've been running around in circles, and you have arrived exactly at the same place from which you thought that you have departed 35 years ago. So that was a really important moment. And of course, I'm not trying to play up the importance for myself. Of course, that war is just a horrible occurrence of historical proportions. But at the same time, it's also something that affects more than just Ukrainians. And then I started thinking about Eastern European identity. So if I am that Eastern European entity that has these particular sensitivities and sensibilities, so what am I? How do I articulate my existence? And that's where somehow I think, and I hope I'll show it to you, that where Søren Kierkegaard comes in, who is not a colonial thinker by any stretch of imagination, but he's a thinker of identity, and he's a thinker of selfhood. So for those of you who don't know, Søren Kierkegaard is a Danish philosopher, writer, and theologian of 19th century. He was born 1813 and died in 1855. An extremely strange, eccentric, even bizarre figure, both as an individual, but also as a writer. He had a peculiar writing strategy. One thing, he was extremely prolific, extremely prolific. He died in his 40s, and by the time he died, he has published more than 20 books. But more than that, he used to publish. So that, of course, we have a lot of people in history who were really prolific, and that's something. But Kierkegaard was not just prolific, but he was also, and not just an extremely prolific writer, but also an extremely prolific and peculiar publisher. So he used to publish his books strategically. For example, he would publish 3 books on the same day. He would choose a particular day in a year where he would publish. He would make it so that 3 books of his come out on the same day. Why it was important to him? Because he would see them as some sort of a bundle where they talk to each other. Another peculiarity was that a lot of those books were written under pseudonyms. But he didn't choose just one pseudonym, as quite a few writers would do. For example, Mark Twain, of course, is not the real name. The real name is Samuel Clemens, but for some reason, he decided that he likes to be Mark Twain, and he wrote all his books under the pseudonym. Kierkegaard doesn't follow this strategy. Kierkegaard has quite a few pseudonyms, but not one, but few. We count up to 15. But interestingly, these pseudonyms don't agree with each other. So, for example, a book written under the pseudonym of Johannes Climacus might criticize the book that is written under the pseudonym of Constantine Constantius. Both of those books are written by Kierkegaard, of course. But he leaves us in this really strange situation. And why I say that, I think it's extremely important, and quite a few readers of Kierkegaard ignore that or forget that. It is important because that does not allow us, when quoting some books by Kierkegaard, to say that Kierkegaard thinks that. If we just follow blindly that all books by Kierkegaard are just representations of his thought, we'll very quickly be left in a bind, in a sense that we'll start contradicting ourselves. So I say that because the book which I want to draw your attention to is also written under the pseudonym. It is the book which is called Sickness Unto Death. And it's written, of course, by Kierkegaard, published in 1849, but the pseudonym that appeared on the title page when it was first published is Anticlimacus. And Anticlimacus is a case in point of, because previous two books by Kierkegaard were signed by pseudonym Johannes Climacus. And Johannes Climacus in Kierkegaard's corpus is this philosopher type guy. He writes two kind of philosophical treatises where he tries to explain in rational terms things about subjectivity, about Socrates, etc., etc. And so this guy, or this pseudonym Anticlimacus, is clearly a reference to Johannes Climacus. We do not know if that means that he completely disagrees with Climacus, or he's just antecedent of Johannes Climacus, or someone who should be read as precursor to Johannes Climacus. Be it as it may, I will quote you just the first passage from Sickness Unto Death, the very, very first paragraph. I quote, "A human being is spirit. But what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation? The self is not the relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself." That's it. And I know it's hard to follow because there's this relation to relation and etc., etc. But there are two things that I want us to take from this quote. It's clear that he's giving a definition of a human being. It's clear that human being is a spirit, but not just any spirit, but a spirit that is a self. And that self is characterized by having a relation to itself. That's the gist of it. And so it's clear what's happening in this description or definition of a human being is that he clearly introduces a human being not as some substance, fixed substance, and ego like you would find in Descartes, that is immutable, constant, and not changing, but to the contrary, human being is a dynamic entity that has a relation to itself and somehow is in constant continuous dynamic, if you will, change. And that's why, if that is correct, if that understanding is correct, then of course a human being can become a problem to itself. If I have a relation to myself, then of course the possibility of the very question, what am I doing, can emerge. Yeah, because I have a relation to myself. This doubling up of a human being as an entity, I think, is crucial here. And so why I give this definition, it's important for us because without this definition, we cannot understand Kierkegaard's, or Anticlimacus in this case, understanding of despair. For Anticlimacus, despair is precisely a misrelation with yourself. A misrelation with yourself, that means that someone or a human being is in despair, not when he or she feels sad, not when he or she feels disillusioned. Anticlimacus talks about that form of feeling. It says sometimes people misqualify it as despair. He says, no. The true despair is having an incorrect relation to yourself. And this misrelation can have three forms. I can see that my time is coming up, but okay. This misrelation can have three forms. The first form of misrelation with yourself is what Anticlimacus terms as despairing ignorance of having a self. And that means, in my understanding, is that we have certain entity that is not aware of itself, so has no self-awareness, has no self-consciousness, has, we could say in Anglo-Saxon tradition, no agency, has no responsibility. If we would look for an example of such an being, such an entity. Those of you who have read Chingiz Aitmatov's The Day Lasts More Than 100 Years, you would immediately think of what he calls Mankurte. Mankurtism is a term which he coins to describe a person who has lost touch with their homeland, who forgot their kinship, who does not recognize anything of their past. So there is a certain form of zombie, if you will. That is what Anticlimacus calls objective despair. But I think the more interesting form of despair, or the more interesting forms of despair, are the subsequent two. And the second form of despair is desperately not to will to be oneself. I think that form of despair, examples are aplenty. Of course, the youngster who imitates a rock star trying to be like Elvis Presley, Jim Morrison, or Britney Spears is a form of despair. Someone like myself who wants to be, or who wanted to be like the Western, like to be in the West, is of course a desperate attempt of not wanting to be yourself and wanting to become someone else. That form of despair can have two forms as well. So one form is to desperately want to be someone else. Anticlimacus calls it the lowest form of despair. But there's also another type of that despair, is to just not want to be yourself, to want to cease to exist. Anticlimacus in this context discusses suicide, but I think in terms of collective identities, we can also talk about just not somehow willing to become someone else, like in the case of Eastern Europeans desperately trying to become Westerners, but we could also talk about forms of national or collective identity which just lose any will to practice their own identities and somehow merge into other entities. So even in Lithuania, we had, during Soviet times, not very popular, but still present ideas of how we should somehow merge with the Russian cultural strand, and somehow this imperial Russian narrative was taken as something that is quite productive and somehow solves a lot of our problems. So we don't have to have any relation with ourselves because it's somehow there's this ready-made solution. And the third, or the most sophisticated form of despair, is desperately to will to be oneself. And I was thinking about an example of that, how that desperation of wanting to be yourself, how it could look. Of course, the first intuitions are about somehow trying too hard, trying to making a decision of who you are and somehow practicing that as a form of duty. The example that came to me is from American writer O. Henry. I don't know if anyone of you have read, but there's a wonderful short story which is called Two Thanksgiving Day Gentlemen. It's about a poor a guy who's called Stuffy Pete, and who has a tradition on every Thanksgiving Day that he goes to this well-off gentleman, and that gentleman feeds him on Thanksgiving Day because that's the American tradition. And so this poor guy, Stuffy Pete, really honors that tradition as the old gentleman who thinks that it's his duty as a young nation to practice and articulate the traditions. And in the typical O. Henry twist, on one Thanksgiving Day, this Stuffy Pete is walking on the street, and suddenly two nuns emerge from their home, and they say, "We have a tradition on every Thanksgiving to feed the first person we meet on the street." So they take the stuff on that particular Thanksgiving Day. The Stuffy Pete is the one who is the first person to be met. So he, of course, he honors the request of the two nuns, and he goes and is really well fed. So he does not need to eat on that particular Thanksgiving Day, but because he honors the tradition, he goes to the old gentleman to honor his duty. So O. Henry ends the short story in this way. He says, on that day, the local hospital admitted two gentlemen. It was Stuffy Pete because he ate too much and he couldn't handle anymore. And the old gentleman, who it turned out didn't eat for a month because he was trying to save money in order to honor the tradition and to feed the Stuffy Pete on Thanksgiving Day. And I think it's a good example, of course, an ironic example of somehow trying too hard to be what you think you are, trying too hard to project your own identity. And I think Anticlimacus is right. It's another form of despair. And how much time do I have?
You have like 10 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, I think that these two forms of despair, the desperately not wanting to be yourself and become someone else, and desperately wanting to be yourself, I think they somehow quite well describe the predicament of Eastern Central Europeans. Anticlimacus's solution to despair is the following. He says to root out completely the despair, one has to stand transparently in the power that established you. That by the power that established you, he of course means God, and he talks about individual self. If we talk about Eastern Europeans, of course, the power that established us is the West. I think it's important to remind ourselves, but also to remind the Westerners, this division that seems to us somehow eternal is really not. As brilliant historian, by the way, who Marcy told me about, Larry Wolff, wrote this book, Inventing Eastern Europe, where he quite poignantly shows that the very idea of Eastern Europe as something backward, lower, etc., is the invention of 17th century. If we look in the Middle Ages, the division between civilization and something lesser in Europe is not between East and West, but between South and North. Southern Italian cities look at Northerners, including the Germanic tribes, as lower, less civilized, more barbaric, etc., etc., etc. It's only in 17th century, with the rise of French Enlightenment, first and foremost, that the very idea that Eastern Europe is somehow more backward emerges. So I think that of course, this idea was captivating and really uh, seductive. It turns out not only to the West and to the French intellectuals who were very keen of writing projects how to save Poland, but also to the Poles themselves and other Eastern Europeans. But I think it's important to remember that this is a historical construct that is not somehow that comes from metaphysical input, but that which means that we are not only shaped by it, but we can shape it too. And I would like to end with a few proposals, what I think we as Eastern Europeans should and could do in order to somehow free ourselves from this idea of Eastern Europe as something that is lesser. I think in short, if you would ask me, I would say we need to grow up. First thing that we have to do is to start taking responsibility for the face of the world. I think it is extremely important for us as Eastern Europeans, if we aspire to be Europeans, to understand that Europe always had an attempt at universal language. And that, if we aspire to be Europeans, includes us too. We do not care about anything outside the West. Anything. It's very hard to find anyone in Eastern Europe who would be willing to talk about things that are taking place in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And even more so to take responsibility for the things that take place there. People, if they're interested, normally it's just for the exotic purposes. I think we need to, in addition to that, to start placing ourselves in this global context. And even when we talk about the war in Ukraine, I don't know how many times I've heard Eastern Europeans talking about this war as if this is the only thing that is happening in the world. It's not. There is a huge civil war taking place in Sudan. On April 13, when Russian rockets killed 34 civilians in Sumy in Ukraine, on the same day in Sudan, in a camp, there were 210 civilians killed. In Lithuania, there was not even a single news item, not a single one. I'm not saying, and it's important to say, I'm not saying that we should stop caring about Ukraine or we should somehow be ashamed that Ukrainian war is much closer to our bodies, sensibilities, that we're much more worried about. For sure, there's no shame in that. But at the same time, when we try to raise awareness of the war, and on what's taking place in the region around the world, and suddenly we're met with really skeptical glances. I think we should know that we do not know about the problems that they are facing. When south of Europe or south of European Union had a migrant problem and went to Brussels and asked European Union to help, most of the Eastern European countries turned away and they said, we are not interested. But when there was a problem on the eastern flank, somehow we got really upset when countries in the south, like Spain and Portugal, didn't share our sensibilities and didn't have the same sense of urgency. And I think this is not just about being, rational, pragmatic, but I think it's just about being an adult, about being grown up and understanding that I'm not the center of the world. Children think that they're center of the world, and I just want this portion of these candies, and I don't care. I think very often we behave like that. And I think the last thing that I would say, which is connected to that, it's about ourselves as some sort of victims. Half, if not majority, of histories of Eastern Europe are histories of victims. In Lithuania, where I will talk about Lithuania because I'm much safer talking about my own country. There's still this story about betrayal of Americans after World War II. But I always ask, but when Americans promised to come and help you? I don't remember that. But somehow we have this feeling that they had to. Why did they? I don't know. And there are many stories like that. This sense of being a victim to whom someone owes something, I think, is not helpful. And it's also not the behavior of someone who takes responsibility for what they are and for the world in which they find themselves. So this refusal to be victims, I think, is an extremely important part of what it would mean for us somehow to grow up and to stop being these lesser versions of the West or Western Europeans. I'll stop here. I think I said enough to provoke disagreement, and then we'll see.
Thank you very much, Viktoras, for such great and rich lecture. I think that we can move on. And Marcy, the floor is yours. Comments, doubts, and questions to Viktoras, please.
Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be here with some of my favorite people from my New Haven kitchen. I hope everyone will come to my new Toronto kitchen, where I'm hoping to move in the next week or two, and there will be a kitchen. And there will be Polish vodka and food, as always. It's true that our kitchen in New Haven, especially after the 2016 elections, it kind of turned into a Soviet kitchen, actually. Like, people were, after the first Trump election, people were staggering in with pizza boxes, opening bottles of vodka, crying, and asking again and again, "Что делать, кто виноват?" Like, what is to be done and who is to blame? These are the classic questions. And I felt like, okay, this is familiar. I kind of like, this is what should be done in a kitchen. And that is actually something from an East European tradition that I, as an American, took on. And in some sense, I took it on as normative. So I'm always very interested as I listen to these conversations about what it means to be a European, what it means to be an East European, what it means to catch up with the West. And I listen from such a strange position because I'm an American who came to Eastern Europe as a young person looking for something else, looking for something that was not what I was or what I had. This can go back to Kierkegaard and the ways in which we flee or don't flee or try unsuccessfully to consummate our own subjectivity, because there was something that was drawing me to Eastern Europe. So just at the moment while East Europeans were trying to become the West and flee to the West, I was trying to flee from America and integrate into Eastern Europe. So this gives me quite a strange position to comment on all these things. And as I'm listening to Viktoras talk, I'm thinking like there were things that were very attractive. And I chose to come to Eastern Europe. I chose to leave the United States, which is where I was from, and at the time the only language I spoke. But also I could have gone to Paris. I could have gone, to London. I could have gone to Madrid. I could have gone to Rome. I could have gone in principle to other places. But there was something specifically about Eastern Europe that was seductive. Now, that would involve, I'm sure, more psychotherapy on my part to like figure out exactly what it was that was seductive. But for me, Eastern Europe was an object of desire precisely at the moment when so many East Europeans were trying to escape from their East Europeanness. So that puts me in a strange dialectical relationship to the whole conversation. And it also perhaps opens an occasion to bring in Levinas, and Levinas's idea of the face-to-face and how desire is desire for the absolutely other. And that the radical alterity and the fact that this was not where I had grown up, this was not what I knew, this was something else. And this was a different relationship to intellectual life. It was a different relationship to food. It was a different relationship to alcohol, different relationship to the kitchen. Like that was extremely seductive. And in some sense, all these decades later remains extremely seductive. Like it's an attachment that has never left me and that I've never regretted. Isa knows a year or so ago, I was having a conversation with a Polish colleague in the States, who herself is Polish, and says, well, I would never give a lecture in Poland in Polish. That's not the proper language of real academic discourse. That's not what we do. That's not what the vocabulary isn't as sophisticated. And I said, well, I give lectures in Poland in Polish all the time, and I make lots of mistakes, and my Polish is not nearly as good as your Polish. But I love that I can do that. Like I've worked really hard to learn these languages, and I will always feel handicapped in them, and I will always make mistakes. But I love being able to enter them, and I love being able to take part of them. And I've never felt like there was something lesser about it. But again, could be my very particular, subject position. Let me maybe throw out just two questions because I want to hear what the audience has to say. I very much relate to Kierkegaard, and I'm thinking a lot of Alexander Watt, who was one of the protagonists of my first book, who was a young Polish futurist born at the turn of the century, who becomes a communist, who read arguably too much Nietzsche and Kierkegaard when he was a very young person, and was obsessed with the unbearable burden of subjectivity. He wrote a wonderful poem called Ja z jednej stronie I ja z drugiej stronie mojego mopco szalonego piecyka, if I'm remembering that correctly, in which he's in this kind of feverish, somewhat drunken 18, 19-year-old state and talking about the desire for self-annihilation as the desire for self-consummation and the unbearable burden of the I. And one of the things I really obsessed about as I followed the young Watts, first his leap into avant-garde aesthetics and this idea that now anything was possible. You could sever the connection between the signifier and the signified, between the word and the thing it represented. There was this kind of nothingness that was nothingness in Sartre's sense as absolute nothing, as radical freedom. And that ecstatic notion of this free fall of everything being possible, and then the radical flight from it into the arms of the communist revolution. And then the discussion that I was having at the time with people like Jochen Halbach from this circle of Soviet historians, meaning historians of the Soviet Union, not people who come from the Soviet Union, who were going back in the 1990s and looking in particular at the Stalinist period through a kind of blend of rereading Arendt now with Foucault, now through the lens of Foucault. And they were trying to make the argument that our notions of subjectivity were too Western in the sense that they assumed that to be a subject meant to be a liberal subject, meant to be an Enlightenment era subject, meant to imbibe certain ideas about the hegemony of reason, and liberalism as a political philosophy coming from Enlightenment reason. Said, what about the creation of an illiberal subjectivity? Why do we assume that subjectivity is a liberal subjectivity? And so then the question that I was interested in was, to what extent was the leap into communism for Watt and his friends an attempt to escape completely and flee from their own subjectivity, or was an attempt to consummate that subjectivity through a radical recreation of a different subjectivity? And of course, the whole genre of Samocritica and the genre of the confession that happens in prison, that happens under interrogation, was part of that. So I feel very close to Kierkegaard's insights that subjectivity is a source of despair, that it's that self-absorption is not just something you revel in, it's something you suffer from, and you truly suffer from it. Mary Gluck writes really beautifully in her biography of the young Lukács about how the epistemological problem about the relationship between subject and object and the distance between them, it wasn't just a theoretical problem for Lukács. He really suffered over that distance between the subject and the object. Like, how do you actually bring yourself into harmony with the world? How do you reconcile consciousness and being? And of course, eventually Lukács found his way to Hegel, and we all know what happens afterwards. So I think Levinas's notion that the self is a source of despair, whether one is trying to consummate it or one is trying to flee from it, one is constantly struggling with it in some way. Maybe I'll just add something also, perhaps too personal, but I'm in the midst of this. I'm in the midst of this moment of grappling again and anew what it means to be American, given the American catastrophe that is somehow more grotesque every day. For those of you who don't know the Polish aphorism by Stanisław Jerzy, I think I have to teach everyone now. Znalazłam się na samym dnie I wtedy usłyszałam pukanie od spodu. Which I noticed in Russian just gets abbreviated to stuk snizu, knocking from below. In Polish, it's I found myself at the very bottom, and then I heard knocking from below. Sometimes I'll hear in Russian, either stuk snizu, knocking from below, or just nizanyet, like there is no bottom. And I feel like every time I turn on the news and see what's going on in my own country, I have the sense of like, there's no bottom. Like we keep falling and falling and falling. And what does it mean to be American under those circumstances? And for the past 3 weeks, I've done little else besides give dozens and dozens of interviews to journalists, for the somewhat strange reason that myself and my husband and our friend Jason Stanley have accepted these offers at the Monk School in Toronto, which in many ways is a completely ordinary thing that people make a mid-career move, and academics move from one good university to another good university. This should not be international news. It's not actually very interesting or very spectacular, but for some reason, the timing of it seems to be provoking people, and especially Europeans, into asking, but could it really get that bad in America? Could this really be happening in America? And so now I'm also seeing America through their eyes. I've now given dozens of interviews to the Germans, to the French, to the Italians, to the Poles, to everybody. And what strikes me is that on the one hand, the West Europeans in particular have this sense of like, America is a barbarian country. We have no real culture, Adorno and Horkheimer, the culture industry. We don't have culture. We just have this trashy Hollywood stuff. And on the other hand, that myth of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and America as the guardian and the guarantor of the post-war order, and the big brother kind of guarding the West, allowing the West to be the West, that, it turns out, runs even deeper than I had previously appreciated, because there is such a desperation not to let go of this. And so like in one conversation after another, I've like these, just at the moment where, of course, people want to be part of the West, and then this sense of, but America can't collapse because it was supposed to be this transcendent object of desire and the Holy Grail and this promised land. And as much as I point out to the journalists again and again, like, remember, we have a country that was built on slavery. we sent racially segregated troops to fight the Nazis. We had miscegenation laws making it illegal, making intermarriage in various states illegal until 1967, until 5 years before I was born. So 22 years after Hitler's regime was defeated, we continue to have miscegenation laws. So I go through all of this, and then I still get, but this it can't really all break down in America. But don't you think that the Trump administration could really be trying to protect Jews from anti-Semitism? And I feel like, okay, you tell me. You're asking me that question, but do you really need me to give you the answer? Because I think you're seeing what I'm seeing, but for some reason are unable to process it. And so, and strangely, in these interviews, instead of the person being interviewed, I feel like I've been playing the role of the psychoanalyst, helping Europeans break through this Freudian denial. And I think this sense of if America is not standing as the guardian of what it means to be the West, then this causes Europeans in general, and perhaps West Europeans and East Europeans in different ways. And I'm curious to see what Victoras thinks about this, to ask, okay, so what is then our reconfigured identity? What does it mean to be the West if we're going to bracket America? I kept pleading with everyone. I'm like, this is it, the end of the affair. You cannot negotiate with this administration. You are looking into a moral abyss. There's no values, there's no principles, there is nothing. You're looking into a moral abyss. You have to take that in. America is going under. Don't let us take you with us. You have to figure out who you are without us. And I'd be interested to hear more about like how does that catastrophe of America or that de-Americanization of America, how then does that reconnect or reconfigure relationships within Europe about what it means to be European, what it means to be East European, what it means to be West European? Okay, I'll let Victoras.
Thank you very much, Marcy. Victoras, please.
Yeah, Marcy, thanks a lot. I was thinking that, I will mention 2022, but I will not be able to mention 2025. So it's good you asked that question and you brought it up, because it is perhaps controversial, but it is my conviction that, in the last 5 years, the most important event that happened for this region is not presidential election in Belarus 2020, not the full-scale invasion 22, but the beginning of the second administration in Washington 2025. And why I think that is because I think that it is pretty clear now to everyone, I think, that this administration in no uncertain terms has signaled to Europe that business as usual since World War II is finished, and so there will be something new. It is not clear what it's going to be for sure, but that is finished. And also, I think it's important to say that a few people think that, oh, maybe this is just just one administration. So this particular president or his team think that, but there will be a new president, etc. But I think it's a little bit wishful thinking, in the sense that this president is in his second term, and it's clear to me that there is enough critical mass within American society that thinks that precisely this modus operandi is what they want. So they try, you can say sometimes, everyone can make a mistake. We elected the wrong guy. We thought, in Lithuania, we elected a guy and then it turned out he's some Russian agent. So we impeached him and we barred him from getting elected again. But in America, with this particular president, it seems that American society tried once, then had a pause and said, no, no, we want more of that. And that seems to me a very strong indication that, this is not just a blip or some kind of glitch in the system, but rather a symptom of some really tectonic shifts within American society that are now coming to the fore. And if that's the case, then these signals that are being sent to everyone around the world, including Europe and Eastern Europe, and in the most pressing case to us in Ukraine, I think they should be interpreted as something that is going to stay. And that means that, this is not, with 2022, you could say this is the revanchism or the comeback of Soviet Union. So, we had like 32 years of some respite, but with the new Trump administration, it changes what has been in place for 80 years, for 70 years. So it's a much bigger change. And that's why I think perhaps, Marcy, that Westerners who have been used to that, or Western Europeans perhaps, they are much more nervous, if you will, because for them there's a much more fundamental change. If I could joke about us Eastern Europeans, we don't get used to anything. I was reading Miloš's book about Europe last week, and he points to one thing that Eastern Europeans, according to him, have in common is the uprootedness. We never settle. We can't afford that. So we had a really nice 35-year pause of relative stability, and now something new is going to emerge. And I think if we talk, because the topic is Eastern Central Europe, I think if we talk about that particular region, it shows there's even more pressing case that we need to grow up and grow up fast. We're not just these wide-eyed children coming to Paris and New York and staring at the neon lights and saying, we've arrived to civilization. Now tell us what to do. It's clear that we have to be creative, we have to be active, and we have to take responsibility. I think it's one of the most important things. No one's going to solve it for us, unfortunately. So that's my take. Of course, I'm not in a position to comment on American situation in the sense what it is to be America. America is an extremely fascinating country and deserves another series of seminars.